Hello everybody, welcome back to JBS. When last we left off, we were in a pretty bleak situation. We were looking at the perished kingdom and how Adam and Eve disobeyed God and rebelled against Him in the Garden of Eden. And because of that, they were expelled from the garden. They marry, they have children, and humanity multiplies and flourishes. But as they multiply, so does their sinfulness. And we see that throughout the rest of the first 11 chapters of Genesis. We see that. And we're left to ask the question, is there any hope for humanity? You know, nobody is fit to be God's people. God's place is empty, and God has to rule through curses rather than through the blessings that He wants to dish out. And so, right at Genesis chapter 12, right after we see this great decline of humanity, a fall from grace, if you will, we're introduced to a character called Abram. And in chapter 12 we're told that God chooses Abram, and they partner together in order to bring about great faith in not just Abraham, but in the rest of the world. And so God makes promises to Abraham. He promises three things. He promises that his offspring would be like the stars in the sky. He promises him the land of Canaan, and he promises that all nations will be blessed through him and through his offspring. And funnily enough, for the rest of Genesis, and actually all the way until the end of Deuteronomy, we're focusing in on Abraham and his offspring. We're focusing on that one first promise, the promise of people. And we go through Abram's family line. His name gets changed from Abram, meaning father of many, to Abraham, meaning father of many nations. And we see Isaac and Ishmael, his two sons, who then go on to make entirely different nations. And then we see Isaac's children, Jacob and Esau, who then also go off and make their own nations. And then Jacob and Esau. And Jacob gets his name changed to Israel, meaning wrestles with God. And that sets the stage for the rest of the Bible. Because for the rest of the Bible, we're following the descendants of Israel, the Israelites. And we see them constantly wrestling with God. Are they going to remain faithful to God? Are they not going to remain faithful to God? What is this going to look like? And how is it going to end up? That's what fulfills the most of the biblical narrative. And we really start to hone in on what's going on right here. Because we see, straight after Genesis, we see the Exodus narrative. And we see this great salvation event where God wants His people back to Him. What He wants, just like in the Garden of Eden, is to have a people that is devoted entirely to Him, in the same way that He is entirely devoted to them. And so He leads them out of Egypt in this great salvation event. And then they need to learn. They need to learn what it means to be God's people. What does it mean to be saved by grace? And then how does that reflect in everyday life? And so they're given many things. They give them Moses as a prophet, someone who speaks with God and who then tells them what to do. They're given the law to help them, to show them what is the right thing, to show them how a sinful people can possibly relate to a holy God, as someone who is completely sinless. And so what we see here is that there's this massive change in a kingdom, because at the very start of Exodus, we're told that the Israelites become incredibly numerous. And so in just a few short generations, in a few hundred years, God's people goes from being no one to being this large nation, this large multitude. And so in this little kingdom here, we see the beginnings. We see the early beginnings of a nation beginning to form. And God has promised that He will partner with this nation. And all of this is expressed in His covenant to Abraham. You know, God, who is God's people? Well, there will be Abraham and all of his descendants. Where is God's place? It will be in the land of the Canaanites. The land of Canaan, otherwise known as the Promised Land. And what is God's rule? Well, once again, just like in the Garden of Eden, it will be expressed through blessing. And it's not just a blessing for Israel, who is supposed to obey, but it's for the rest of the nations through Israel. And so we're going to have a little look about we're going to have a little look at what that looks like practically in the partial kingdom, and what it looks like when the nation actually gets up off its feet. Once they actually move into the land, we're going to see what it looks like to live that life and how the Israelites go about that. But for right now, we're going to leave it off right there. Abraham's a pretty good guy. He follows God by faith and faith alone, and so he tries to teach his children how to do the same thing. But as we see from this little kingdom, even this rest of Genesis, it is quite an uphill battle. There's a constant conflict going on between the human's sinfulness and God, and the faithfulness that he deserves. And so we're going to leave it there with this little conflict, and next week we're going to come back with the partial kingdom, and we're going to see what does it look like when God's promises are partially fulfilled but not entirely.